It's me again. Yay! So we will pick up some themes from what we looked at in the website, especially linking historical perspectives and understanding how language changes to looking at variation today. And in this session, we're going to talk about some of the new findings from our Generations of London English project, where we're looking in real time at how speech is changing. We have this amazing opportunity because Paul Kurzweil, Jenny Cheshire, and their colleagues did, as you know, a phenomenal amount of work 15, 20 years ago documenting multicultural London English. And one of the goals of this project was to look about 18 to 20 years on and see what's happening. And it's unusual to have that chance when a new dialect is formed to look at the first two generations. It's not the only thing we're doing on the project. I'll show you a bit more in a moment. But we are going to, because we're looking in real time, and we're going to look at how teenagers were speaking when Paul Kurzweil, Jenny Cheshire did their work, and what we see now in the same part of London. We want to, again, keep in mind how language changes. And just as a reminder, we think of language as changing in waves that go through a speech community. There's our little person experiencing different changes at different times. And as you know, just from general sociolinguistics research, many social structures organize those changes. So it might be social networks, how we interact with different audiences, communities of practice, individual effects, and how we learn languages. But what we're going to look at in this session is a slightly different question, which is how fast change happens. It's something we don't always stop to think about. Is it always changing at the same speed, or is it uneven, and if so, why? So we're going to look at how steady and how fast changes. We have this opportunity with this 20-year window that I'm going to share with you. And we're also going to look a little bit at how varied individual speech is while they're going through these changes. There's a lot that we can say about the third one, so this is just one, just a little bit of material for you to explore. And one of the reasons it's in this session is when we look at rate of change, we do these big projects where we get a couple of hundred people, a big time span, and we generalize away from the individual. So I'll show you, we have these big graphs of how frequently people are using some linguistic features. And we forget the individual. We have to generalize. But at the end, we're going to come back to what individuals that we're talking about in these big pictures are actually doing, how varied they are. And it comes back to something we mentioned briefly in the previous session. I mentioned a couple of East Enders who have a very broad repertoire of speaking. And that's actually very important in our story of change that we look at. So in this session, we're going to look at multicultural London English over 20 years, and we're going to ask this question about rate of change. So is it steady or uneven? Is the language changing as fast as Paul Kurzweil was showing for phonology, Jenny Cheshire's work on syntax that changed a lot about 40 years ago? And as I said, we'll end with looking at individual range and how it links to that big picture. So the key concepts we're going to focus on are rate of change. It's hard to look at, but we have that opportunity. We're going to look at an idea that's taken from biology. You don't really have to use this term, but it's a handy way to talk about unevenness. So I'll come back to explaining punctuated equilibria. And then we're going to end with repertoire and a reminder that what the individual does in their daily life is actually the underpinning these differences in rate of change. Okay, so to get started thinking about this, we have a few lead-in discussion tasks that you have in the materials. And both of these tasks that we're going to look at will help shift your thinking to how fast language is changing rather than just examples of it changing. And as before, linking past and present. So the first is, we don't really need to do this together, but you could ask what, if you're asking your students, how do people react to young people's language? We've touched on this a bit, so we won't do this particular task. And how does it differ from earlier varieties? But what I would like to briefly do together, just to try out this task, is to chat about, we've talked a bit about what makes language change, but to think about going back in time and how different the language would be. So just a minute or two, if you were sent back 100 years and you were in London, how difficult would it be to communicate? But you have to be your present self. It could be fine because you were born 100 years ago. But anyway, you're going from today. Everyone else is the old type of person. How difficult? And then talk about 600 years. And of course, we have different amounts of knowledge of how language was. But just a quick chat about what you think. Sorry to give you such little time. So what do you think? Any thoughts? I just have lots and lots of things to share with you. So any thoughts about what you think about either 100 or 600 years ago? Yes?
We said that there might be kind of simple communication be okay, but if there were like cultural references maybe, or like social accepted phrases, like we were saying, like, oh, I'm just going to nip to the loo, that might be like socially not like allowed to be, said. So
yeah,
you probably would communicate okay, but there would be probably little stumbling points.
100 years ago. Yeah, that's a nice example, that it's not just register, but appropriate etiquette, appropriateness of language by domain. That's a great example. Anything else?
I think 100 years ago would be okay, but it would certainly be broader. Like if I listen to my family has some recordings from like 60 years ago, and it's I can understand it, but it's very much marked Yorkshire, much broader. 600 years ago would be tricky.
So yeah, so probably everybody felt, the further back you go, the harder it gets. But you might have had that sense that it's just a continuously worse situation, right? That, well, it's just going to get worse and worse. So you get this sense that it could just be steadily more different. And we're going to see that's not really how it is. Actually, they're good and bad centuries to choose. So, but it's a good discussion to have. In fact, it would even be quite good to ask about 1,000 years ago, because some, much bigger changes happen. So there's actually some abrupt changes that make it much worse, but 600 is pretty bad already. But it's a good setup for the slightly inaccurate assumption that it's going to be steadily worse, that change just progresses at the same speed. So let's look at the Lord's Prayer, and you might ask about sources. Again, this example is used a lot in History of English. So some History of English textbooks will have these materials. I'm happy to send examples to you. But let's do this together. I know it's not the teenage speech, and I have to be careful not to get carried away with, this is just a step on our way to looking at teenagers, but it does link directly. So here is the Lord's Prayer at 4 different time points historically. I'm getting the feeling that we shouldn't do this task in too much detail, but let's just briefly think about whether you think this is obviously follows directly from what we just talked about, 100 years ago, 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Do you think it's the language is changing at a regular rate, or do you think there's a bigger change? I'm asking in the most general way, a bigger change from one to another than others? You're all pointing at those two, right? So are some of you pointing at Old English to Middle English?
Yeah.
So Old English, and this is why we just can't, it's all or nothing with this task. If we do it, we'll spend an hour on it. But if you have encountered Old English, you know that actually what you're seeing, if we look past orthographic differences, which are obviously also changing, you see word order differences, you see case marking, so all the ums are dative case. You see prefixes, ye, halgod, so that got lost, so mean perfective marker. You can see forgive is taking different forms, different suffixes. So that is it's German. It's got a whole grammatical, morphological, inflectional system that's different. And Middle English is, what we're seeing there is what emerged after French contact. So English did this amazing thing in the textual record of English. It just got submerged for 150, 200 years. We just have this gap. And then after that, it's quite an extraordinary textual record. You see this different language emerge. So there was a very big change between those two for social reasons that we saw in the website. And actually, if we analyze those things, even though these later varieties, versions of English are changing, the degree of change is much less. So the one thing to take away from this is that contrary to that initial feeling we had, like, oh, if we keep going back in time, our time machine, set it 100 years more, it's going to be that much worse. It's not at all like that. You know that already, that actually there were certain points when it changed a lot and other points where, I mean, I would happily go back a couple of 100 years. I feel like we could make it work. But Old English, even Middle English, right? I feel like we could do it. So the first thing is, already we know from looking at the history of English, there are abrupt changes sometimes and changes slower sometimes. So we'll keep that in mind and start looking at MLE. And I'm just going to present a little bit of this so that you can work with the data a little bit as well. So we've zoomed ahead, but we'll keep in mind that lesson that we know already very well, that English has, the rate of change has been very uneven. And we're going to start by looking at Paul Kurzweil's original MLE picture of what happened, how MLE looked. So this is just a screenshot. It's not the full task. You have the full documents online. But we're going to look at two vowel charts. We won't spend a lot of time on them because we actually want to look at Paul's original work and then see whether teenagers' language is changing at the same rate as what Paul described in his original MLE description. So I'm going to skip ahead. These vowel plots are from earlier work that's formed the kind of reference point for our current project. And we won't go through this in too much detail. I think the main thing to notice, have you looked at vowel plots like this before? So if you look at the top left corner, well, get my left and right. So where it says kit, if you say E, you can feel, and I think you may have done this with your students a lot, E, you can feel your tongue up behind your teeth, behind the palate. E, you can feel your tongue pressing. If you say oo, E, oo, you can feel the tongue high but moving back and forth. E, oo, can you feel that? So where goose, so when do you see how goose has moved over to the left in the 2005 plot? That means it's being pronounced more front, more like geese, closer to the E sound that you made. So there are all kinds of changes, and we don't have time to go into them. But one general one that you can see is the lines are shorter, and the lines are showing that diphthongs, so two vowels like face and goat. I'm a terrible person to, and also people, northerners here, a lot of my vowels are not very diphthongal because Indian English has a lot of monophthongs, but goat, price, face, mouth, you can see that the vowel moves a lot. So face, A, or I, face, And they're much shorter here. So there are all kinds of changes that happened in MLE, and I won't go into a lot, but the whole phonology change, Paul is the person to ask if you have questions about that change. The main reason I'm sharing this with you is that there's no question that there was a big change from Cockney vowels to the MLE phonology about 40 years ago. And our question actually in this session is, has that dramatic amount of change continued at pace? Does that make sense? So we have this opportunity 20 years on to say, is it still going, you know, because there's been a lot of migration, social change. So the one other detail, and this is set up as a task if you want to do it with students to look at some of these vowels. But if you look at goat, you can see that the elderly white British man has a long diphthong, and it's, Paul, let's hear it. I'll do the young Afro-Caribbean man. Gout. So it's a little central, but it's not going back. And then the second one, Paul does this a lot more often than me, but go. Yeah. So it's more back and then goes even further back. So these two types of goats, think of a Cockney goat and then, sorry, and now I know we're all thinking of a goat. And then go, which we mentioned Stormzy, so a more contemporary goat. These are very different vowels, so think of them as two different types of goat. Actually, we're finding in our data, there's very little in between. It's not like people are on a range, so it's two different forms. So we're interested in that. We're going to look at that in a little detail now together. In our project, as I said, we want to know, here we have a chance, 20 years on, do we see that much change? So we have, this is our project team, and we're doing a lot of different things on this project. What we're going to talk about today is this question of how teenagers are speaking 20 years on, but just mentioning background projects that are relevant, and actually what we call GLE, the Generations of London English Project, is trying to zoom out a little bit. So it's not only MLE strictly, but looking more at features across lots of groups. But we are going to, for today, stick to the teenagers. And as you can see, one group is the original data set that Paul, on his projects, collected. And we're analyzing it again alongside our new data. Just for interest, I believe a couple of people were asking about re-recording. I think at the end I can come back to it. You were interested in re-recordings of participants from Paul's original project. I'm happy to come back to that. And we're also tracking kids. Elisa has been doing all of that. And so, yeah, we have some other perspectives on change in this group. So let's stick to teenagers. I'll skip this slide. It's just telling you that the numbers and some of the methods. But the main thing to take away is that we are looking at a similar number of teenagers in East London. I'm happy to go into some of these details later if you have questions. But we want to focus on that question for today, which is what is happening, what has happened since the original MLE projects. So one prediction we could make is that we have early formation of a dialect, and then it keeps changing a lot. So we, for instance, get sub-dialects developing. So this odd, I never know if visualizations work for people, but if you think of time downwards, you could have a kind of immediate formation of a dialect and then social subtypes separating out and continuous change. But you could also have something that's also been discussed for new dialect formation, which is founder effects, that the founding groups set the system, the social system, and that's quite stable now. So it's two of several possibilities we might see over time. And in fact, in the original projects, there's an element of both that were discussed, but without the time dimension, it's hard to know. Let's analyze this together. I'll show you one of many different features that we've looked at to start with. So we looked at goat just now, or we all had two different goats. And I'm going to show you some results for the earlier data set and 20 years later now. And I think what we'll do, this is the description, the part of the description that you have. I'll just ask you to analyze it. So here's what I'm going to show you is go. Am I doing it? Okay. I have to do other people's accents. But it's the MLE goat. So when you see bars in the charts, it's going to be how often you use that goat, not a standard goat. Or a Cockney goat. But MLE. So the higher the bar, the more the MLE goat is being used. Okay, so let me ask you to briefly discuss any patterns you see. On the left, you have the data from the original MLE projects, Paul's data, 2000s and 2020s. I should say that these are not, so let me just explain the plot, because we do statistical analysis, and so you're not seeing the raw counts of those pronunciations, although can you see the black dots? The black dots are the raw frequency of how often that group used this MLE pronunciation. But the colored bars are the output of a statistical analysis that takes into account other factors. So if it's higher, it's basically saying, even when I take into account other factors, this ethnicity or gender is even more significant, if that makes sense. So it's a kind of adjusted, we tend to give this adjustment because it takes into account all kinds of other possible reasons it's varying. But we're just going to talk about the bars. Don't worry about the big dots for now. Just take a minute to talk about the results, what you see, and then we'll pool your observations. Number of individuals.
So tokens and number of
Yeah, the brackets is how many people are in that category. So 99 tokens, 99 goats, and 4 people in that group. Sorry. And the tiny dots are individuals' rates. I hope everyone can see the heritage groups at the bottom. That's crucial. Okay, and then men and women. These are age 16 to 19, so boys, girls, or men and women. Okay, any generalizations? Anyone want to make an observation about what we are seeing? Big gender difference. How would you describe the gender difference?
It's making me think about the Trustfield Norwich study where you've got the more non-standard forms being prevalent in male speakers.
Yeah, for this feature, boys are using it more in general. But there's an interesting group among the women.
What's going on with the South Asian women?
Yeah, so this is a good example where it's possible to misread a plot, because we might conclude, wow, the South Asian girls are so vernacular, they're doing tough MLE, but it's not really the case, because there is also a heritage language source for this goat. But in fact, you can hear it a little bit with me. So I have a less diphthongal, more back goat, I guess. And so we did actually do acoustic analysis looking at, and it is in its profile a little different to the goat that the boys are producing. So it seems likely that it's actually coming directly from their South Asian language influence. There's also an interesting social network detail here that we haven't presented here for you. But there are different degrees to which these groups are networked with each other. And South Asian girls, for some of the groups, are quite separated networks from the boys, even from some of the other girl groups. So, so that's important, that this looks like they are high users of that, but it's a slightly different source for why they have that type of goat vowel. Anything else? What about the time dimension? What was that? There's almost no difference, right? It's quite stunningly similar, I feel. Yeah, so it looks like in the data that Paul's original projects collected, which is on the left, there was already, what they described was already in the papers that they published, that boys were leading in the use of this feature, but we'll see some other features. Secondly, you may have noted in your discussions that they're more multi-ethnolectal. Can you see how they're more, except for the white boys who are behind in lots of MLE features, actually, they are lower users. How shared it is across the other three ethnicities, unlike girls. And something we're finding really for girls is they are a little bit, although they also use MLE, and that's why it's very awkward to use these labels. We'll come back to that at the end. They are a little bit more mono-ethnolectal, which was kind of a little bit implicit in the original work, but now we can really flesh it out, seeing. So, like I said, the South Asian girls have their reason for having a vowel like this, but it's not the same as the boys use. Notice the little dots. I don't know if you commented on those, but can you see among the boys, in both time points, there are a couple of very high users. The little dot is an individual. And if you look at the two blue bars for boys, can you see right at the top there are high users of the MLE goat vowel. Can you see how girls don't have that, the white girls? We don't have these. So you have, and it's also very consistent with the original descriptions on the MLE projects, that some white British boys do converge a lot with MLE style, but the girls not so much at all. So it's actually the white British girls who are sustaining the traditional vernacular in many ways. It's quite an interesting gender-driven system. But I'll show you very briefly, because we have some nice recordings to listen to. Oops, I'm in the wrong. So this is just a summary of what we were seeing. So L at the end of words, coda L, so end of words like ball and school. You can see just briefly that it's much more of a mono-ethnolectal. It's wasn't described as an MLE feature, and it's pretty restricted to South Asian heritage teenagers. We see a little bit with Caribbean and African speakers. It's not, I won't go into it, but it's not really recognized in terms of, we talk about social indexicality. It's not one of the markers of MLE use. It's just, I've included it to show that there are also features specific to certain ethnic communities. And that's why sometimes you hear a speaker and you say, this is an MLE speaker, he's definitely Asian as well. You can get both in bits of information. And K backing is something that, so it's like cousin. So the K at the beginning of certain words, before certain vowels. But notice here that, again, South Asians leading, but there's a slightly different pattern. These kinds of statistics are a little bit hard to, I'm not presenting the results, but actually K backing, saying college cousin, Sam can produce these very easily, is very MLE compared to, it comes across as that, whereas coda L is not. And one interesting detail is that it might be linked to Muslim heritage, so that might explain some of the overlap. So for instance, Somali kids within the African group might be doing it more. It's not absolute, but it has some of these. It's a newer feature that we're looking at. But again, notice how consistent over time. So when we look at multiple variables, features, we start to convince ourselves. If we see just one, then we don't want to make a big claim about change in real time being slower because we've only looked at one thing. But when we see it again and again, we get more persuaded that change is not happening at the same rate, right? It seems very stable. It seems very much the second prediction, where there was a founding system by gender and ethnicity that was described in the original projects, and actually it's remained stable. So I'm going to skip this one. I put it there because I didn't want you to think that all of them look like this, because these are a bit similar. But DH stopping, you know this feature. So saying dem, dare for there and them, but also them and there, which I have, which is more Asian, which is the lighter green. It's also very systematic. You can see, for instance, the light green for the girls, South Asian girls leading. Can you see that? That's again South Asian girls being kind of separated off with their own sub-style of MLE that has more features from the heritage language, and then sharing of the other stop. But so I won't go through all of these points, but the main thing, hopefully, that's very clear to you is there's a lot of social structure by ethnicity and gender, and the intersection of the two. Boys being more multi-ethnolectal, girls having these more separated styles of speech. Siobhan Gates, a PhD student who looked at a school, found very big differences in girls' school networks and boys. That the girls had all these ethnically distinct subgroups that they named, where the African girls, where the Muslim girls, and the boys were like, I'm broadly in this amorphous group A and group B. It's very different social networks. So quite interesting gender details, but quite stable since the early stages. I'm going to skip this because I want you to do more with audio, but syntax, we did a survey of judgments, and syntax supports this. So the quick way to look at this is the 50+ respondents, 40, 50+, have much lower acceptance, can you see, of these MLE syntactic constructions. So that's that jump in saying, let's go Sainsbury's. Can you see how it kind of goes more abruptly up for younger groups? If you look at why are you shouting at me for, you see the blue line is quite high, except when you get to the older group and it's lower. And that's around when MLE formed. So even with syntax, you can see the abrupt formation and then kind of steady. But we won't go into these details. So looking over real time, we've seen that we can contextualize the original description of MLE in a wider picture of how language is changing and how fast it's changing. So really, from many projects, we can describe London varieties in the 20th century as first having new mono-ethnolectal varieties. So you know London Jamaican, you'll have heard of the early, so in the 70s and 80s, the London Jamaican, Black British styles becoming the kind of currency for youth language. And then British Asian English developing, but not having the same role. But as Paul and Jenny's original work described, there was a big change in the 90s in terms of migration patterns, in terms of acquisition patterns. We had this abrupt change that we saw in Paul's vowel plots and in the syntax. But now we see it settled back into a stable new vernacular. So it's like a kind of blip. And that's what has been described. So in biology, there's this concept of punctuated equilibrium, which is how species formation works, that you have kind of stability and then punctuations of species kind of diversification. But it's very uneven. And that term, although it's a bit, it's just in a way metaphorical, it's been adopted by some linguists to talk about language changing in this uneven way as well. So there's quite a lot of research that says language change in general is slow. There are lots of reasons we don't keep changing our systems. You can imagine, right? What would be some reasons? There are structural reasons, but any other reasons why basically language doesn't change too much. Communication. Anything else?
Influence of literacy?
Yeah, that's interesting. Can be, yeah, more for syntax. Yeah. It's the test of that would be to look at languages that are oral languages, and actually it's for phonology it doesn't make a difference, but definitely for registers and for syntax probably. But yeah, communication, also acquisition. So how kids learn language, you know, they'll obviously be matching what they're around. There are all these kinds of, you know, pressures. But certain events can blow things up in different ways. So we talked about the Normans, we've talked about formation. Actually, the colonial period, maybe not as abrupt, but brought in these influences. And now the early MLE work showed us that. But it's very interesting to have this non-finding in our project where not much is changing, because then we see, oh, it settled down again. It was another one of these little punctuations. So in the history of English research, this term has been used for the effect of the Norman invasion. That's why I wanted to show you the Lord's Prayer, because it shows so clearly the linguistic outcome of massive social change. And maybe MLE isn't on that scale, of course it's not, but there was some identifiable social change in the second half of the 20th century, and we saw one of these blips, and it's interesting to see how stable it's been since. So, we have a few minutes left, and maybe I'll pause because we've looked at rate of change, and I've tried to show you both historically and now that there's this unevenness where the default is slow and some things might speed up change. But we're going to shift to remembering the individual and looking at repertoire, especially in Black British English, just as a reminder of a few things. Any questions or comments on this? I wanted you to do a bit of listening and discussing with the next section, so I thought it's a good point to pause. Anything? Okay, so yeah, so as I said at the beginning, it's fun to do big studies where you get these kind of, bird's eye view of what's going on. You have to generalize over groups when you do this. And so I feel like it's almost our duty to end by going back into the individual and actually seeing what are individuals doing within this situation of change. And when we do that, we'll see that there's some actually crucial bits of understanding for how, it actually goes back to the last session, how the new vernacular might become a part of standard language. So we know a lot of social factors that govern language variation and change, but we want to look at repertoire just for a couple of minutes. And I'm going to focus on Black British English or Londoners from Caribbean and African heritage in our data for two reasons. One, that as Paul has written about and others, different varieties of Black London English have been central both in MLE and in the development of youth vernaculars and of vernaculars in London. And with the new project, we see even more detail of that role. And secondly, there is a lot of direct equating of MLE and Black speakers. And it's quite, especially public perceptions, and it's very inaccurate for actually what's going on and now what we can show with our data of what young and middle-aged, actually young and middle-aged Black Londoners do. So we're going to look at a few speakers together and link it to the big picture. So I'm going to play you a couple of voices without any labels. And we'll just listen to them together and tell me what you associate with these voices. It's not really a trick, so don't worry. It's more to hear the diversity across the recordings. and different varieties that you will associate with these. So let me play one. Hopefully it'll work.
Well, back in the day, say for instance it was like school holidays and things like that, obviously your parents would go to work.
Yeah.
What they would do is we'll have the keys left underneath the mat so you can get in and out.
Yeah.
Is that loud enough? Should I play it again? Try and associate it with one of the classic accents of London that we talked about. I'll play it again. Don't know if I can. I don't want to press something and. Don't know. Oh, okay. That's okay. All right.
Well, back in the day, say for instance it was like school holidays and things like that, obviously your parents would go to work.
Yeah.
What they would do is we'll have the keys left underneath the mat so you can get in and out.
Yeah.
So could you hear him say in and out and go to work? It's hard to produce. What accent would you say this is? Cockney. So these are all black speakers. So that's a Cockney speaker. What about this one?
And the dominoes of the...
Yeah,
Can't you hear them old heads, you know?
It's a bit hard to play.
And the dominoes of the...
Yeah,
Can't you hear them old heads, you know?
It's a little bit.
And the dominoes of the...
Yeah,
Can't you hear them old heads, you know?
It's actually, yeah. Sorry.
Feels like a real mixture.
It's a mix. Yeah, there is a little bit. So the way he said, yeah, is pretty standard sounding. Can't really play them as a little bit of a Caribbean. I don't know if you can hear. It's like in the.
Dominoes sounded almost RP.
Yeah, so he's a bit of a mix. He's a South London speaker with a little Caribbean influence and kind of SSB. Here's another.
You know what it is I hear it though? But it sounds like you man hate on Saka just because you guys don't like Arsenal fans. So you guys hear how much we glaze Arsenal fans.
So much passion in it. Again, it's quite a subtle. I'll play again.
You know what it is I hear it though? But it sounds like you man hate on Saka just because you guys don't like Arsenal fans. So you guys hear how much we glaze Arsenal fans.
Any Saka and though, said though and hate. Emily speaker. And then this is one person in two different situations.
Because if I do it, by the time I've run away from the house, they've seen me.
Very standard speaker. And with the friend.
4-man step to Maddox. Any tables come. Jeez. Man like, you man are going in.
Same speaker. More MLE. He's actually doesn't go to, his phonology doesn't go very MLE, but he's completely changed syntax and lexicon, a little phonology. So these are, just to get us started, I feel it's important to say, when we talk about black speakers in London, they cover every variety in London. And I'll show you some more detail for this. It's not one community, so it's also important to talk about Caribbean, African heritage separately. But it's a range, and I wanted to focus on repertoires, and that's why the last example, we'll hear a bit more of that. So let me give you a little background, and we'll listen again. There are tasks available to you to do some of this together, but I think since we just have 5 minutes, we'll do this together. So before we go to the next couple of audio clips for you, I wanted to give you the social background and the recent historical background for who you heard. So just like Asian speakers over the age of 45, black speakers in London will have, depending if they have lower middle class, upper working class backgrounds, they will have acquired the local vernacular of their time, which was a Cockney or traditional. I have recordings from West London of Asians who can sound Cockney, authentic. That's the vernacular they grew up around, but they are often bi-dialectal because it's a kind of survival in London, right? So I mean, one of my Asian participants in a previous project said, well, I didn't want to get beaten up every day, so I was able to sound, like a local vernacular guy. I could, very broad repertoire range. There's an interesting effect that we need a project on that I'm planning to do, where if you look at who has a broad repertoire, it's often vernacular speakers who are undergoing social mobility. You might say it's just about situations, but if you look at middle and upper middle class speakers, they may have a wide range, but they rarely develop they don't have to, right? So if you have a standard speaker, they very rarely have developed the vernacular range, but vernacular speakers very often, unless they're quite isolated in terms of social class. So it's asymmetric who's doing the work. But another important thing we don't have time to go into is that South London, now we have recordings of teenagers from there as well, shows an earlier, more focused. It became a variety a little earlier in a way, and was the core, one of the core inputs that Paul's talked about for what we see in East London, which is much higher contact in some ways. So we have this distinction that's useful. And we'll end with looking at, sorry, the person I'll play is a teenager, but the person you heard with two different styles, the one you just heard, he's in his 30s, and he represents a group in our data, because we have data that's not teenagers only, also adults. He represents a group that's very noticeable in our data of 30-something young men who are Black, typically African heritage, who are experiencing a huge degree of social mobility. So this is from the Sutton Trust showing university participation, and if you look at the participation of young Black, this is in the UK, you see the degree of social mobility for this group, and it's a very important element in understanding when we look at London speech, what's going on, why do we see it? And that's why I mentioned earlier in the previous session, people like Idris Elba, if you see Black celebrities, British celebrities, you often see that they have this speaking range because they're coming from a vernacular background, and then they develop these multiple codes. So in terms of change, because we're looking at change in real time, it's actually very important for the big picture we were looking at. Because if you think about that guy who said, four-man step, by the way, is 4 people double date. You might have heard it. It's kind of a useful term. I think it's like 4 guys bring a girlfriend and go out together. I thought I had to look it up and find out, or ask my kids. But if you think of that guy, how much he was switching his way of speaking, these are the people who are MLE speakers. They switch it off. A lot of our 30-something Black participants are working in finance. They're going into law, but they come from Tottenham. They come from Lewisham. Their background is working class moving into middle class. They bring mild MLE into their work context. And in other work, we've actually found that it's quite high rated, very mild MLE, because people like the presence of diversity. They're very judgy about strong MLE. So actually, when we look at, we talk about, will MLE be the new standard? And it's a hard question to answer. But when we see these kinds of data, we realize that it could be those socially mobile speakers who bring the very tiniest bits of MLE into the standard that's possibly the source of, the unmarking that we were talking about in the last session. We have a couple of, we have a task for you that I think we could do. The last 2 things I have for you are still to do with repertoire and Black speakers' broad range. Let's just do it together. It's fun to listen and then finish in 5 minutes. Is that okay? So one is a task, and another is just something for you to listen to that gives you another perspective on individual variation. So here we're back to teenagers, and I think the task is available to you, but I can just play you this together. So with this one, in the task, you could focus on the face vowel. So we talked about the goat vowel, a way of identifying the sound O in different words. With this task, you could get your students to look for A vowels. So we'll call it the face vowel. But in the, sorry, I'll go back. In the transcript, all 4 of these clips have that vowel. So one task is just to spot them. Played as one example. But we're going to not focus on face. We'll just listen to the shifting that's in these recordings that you have for the task. So this is a Black Caribbean heritage teenager and a white British heritage teenager. These are actually different recordings. And what you'll see, this is just, we're not going to generalize from it, but it's a good illustration of one person who doesn't vary how he speaks very much by situation, and one person who does. So I'll skip that, but it illustrates some of what we're hearing. But let's just focus on these. So I will play you all 4, and just tell me what you think of them. So the dotted line is when the interviewer leaves the room. And they were told, I'm going to leave, you can do what you like. We left some kind of funny or controversial topics for them to talk about. If they want, they could just pull out a prompt, or they could just chat. So they knew that they were being left alone to not have the interviewer present. So I'll play you Jim 67 before and after. And tell me what you think. I mean, I've given you the answer on the table there, but have a listen.
I mostly played football when I was growing up. That's how I really made friends.
I'll play it again.
I mostly played football when I was growing up. That's how I really made friends.
And then when he's just alone with his friend.
My sister here, she must have stained my fucking Air Force Ones.
Play again.
My sister here, she must have stained my fucking Air Force Ones.
So, could you hear what did and didn't change for his speech? What did change? I mean, it's written there, but swearing. But could you hear that his phonology doesn't change? So if you listen closely, it doesn't change, and he doesn't really vary very much in his speech. Must have is a nice detail there. It's an MLE feature that Jenny Cheshire and other colleagues wrote about. It sounds like standard use, but he knows the facts, right? We don't usually say must have. You know, I don't say I must have given a talk at York, right? Because I know the facts. Usually I say I gave a talk. So it's actually an MLE syntax feature that he has there. But so he didn't change. But listen to Jim 68 with the interviewer.
My dad was born in the Caribbean, came here. My mum is a beautician, a makeup artist and a hairstylist.
And then after he's left?
Fam, I used to get relegated. I used to always go there earlier.
So you hear the DH stopping, go there. And so he's just shifted. It's very natural. It's not extreme. But he has a much bigger range generally in his recordings. So this is an illustration of what I was showing earlier as well with the recordings, that it's not exclusive. So we have a lot of variation in who has a broad repertoire or narrow. But I do think for especially young black men and in their late 20s and 30s, it's an important element in MLE getting a mild type of MLE getting integrated into wider London English. And to end, I think we won't have time to talk about them. They're not in a task. But it's a contrast that's nice to be aware of. Maybe we could develop it as a task at some point. A quick contrast that is style shifting, which is what we just saw, versus stylization. So it's a very useful contrast to be aware of. I think young people, we all stylize as well. And stylization is a much more marked performance of another code, another way of speaking. So I'll play these to you. So style shifting, you're familiar with, that these are style shifts, not very dramatic change. It's just I style shifted, the way I'm talking now is not how I would talk to my dad. But here is a stylization. I'll give you two. They're quite nice to hear just for completing the picture of what we're talking about. This is where A is reading out one of those prompts that we left them with.
What are you afraid of?
What am I afraid of?
Yeah, tell us something you're afraid of. I don't know.
Man's a big man, isn't it? I'm just not afraid of anything.
I'm not that scared of much either.
I'm a religious man, I'm afraid of God.
But I should say, I really like this. So could you hear him stylizing MLE? He is an MLE speaker, but he stylizes a stronger MLE. And you can tell because his pronouns go back to standard use of pronouns. But I love this because he sounds a little bit Asian, and he's in East London, and he's talking about religion in a way that's a kind of Muslim style, but he's a white British heritage kid. So you see a little bit of Asian influence because the demographic proportions have shifted. And so, but this is stylization where you can see how he says psh at the beginning and end. So it's almost like quotation marks. You mark out, and we all do it, right? Like sometimes you do an American accent just to show some kind of stance. But it's quite important for change because it characterizes that accent or that voice with a certain. So this is a lovely one that I leave you with of a African heritage teenage girl in South London and stylizing an African variety.
I don't want to be like dependent on somebody, like you're at home, baby mama, doing that. It's just never my life. I want to be able to get up, know that I'm a businesswoman.
Amen.
Go do that.
So could you hear, she said businesswoman, CEO or something, and amen is recognizing the stylization. So, but it's a lovely example of how she's framing African varieties of English very aggressively positive. You know, that if I want to talk about being a tough, successful woman, that's the, so you see, we've gone from that big picture to the smallest level of little bits of stylization, but how powerful those little acts are for resisting negative stereotypes, for instance. So in sociolinguistic analysis, we also want to pay attention to those moments. And I do think style shifting versus stylization when we look at repertoire is a useful contrast. So I'll end there, but we've gone, we've focused in this session on how fast language is changing, which is a different kind of question. We're fortunate to have Paul Kurzweil, Jenny Cheshire's early work to compare, and we found that things have completely slowed down in some ways. So we got that punctuated equilibrium kind of support for that model. But then we looked at repertoires as actually at the micro level showing us some of the mechanisms for how these new ways of speaking might be getting unmarked and diffused. It doesn't mean the whole of MLE becomes a new standard, but a few elements might diffuse and become new standard forms. Thank you. I'll stop. So yeah, again, I'm a little bit over. If there are quick questions, I guess, and then we should stop. But questions, or you could also email me if you have questions.
So we officially have a break.
A break.
Mm-hmm. So you could ask a couple of questions and then, if anybody has any, or you can just run for coffee. There'll be more time for questions.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much.